The palace corridors had
What
never
is this?
felt so
Are you
cold,
serious?
even in the height
Just
of
a
summer.
routine check, sir.
Prince
This
Harry
is
adjusted
absurd.
his collar nervously
Sir,
as
an
he
urgent
approached
message.
the ornate
What is it?
doors
A
of his
security
father's
alert. You
private
must move.
study.
Understood.
What
Lead the
should
way.
have been a simple family meeting had transformed into something that felt more like a diplomatic negotiation between warring nations. The irony wasn't lost on him that he needed security clearance to speak with his own father, but the events of the past few years had created chasms that seemed impossible to bridge. Outside those same palace walls, photographers waited with telephoto lenses, ready to capture any hint of reconciliation or further division. The world watched every move, every gesture, every carefully worded statement that emerged from the House of Windsor. But what the public didn't know was how deep the security protocols now ran, how every conversation was scrutinized, and how trust had become the rarest commodity in one of the world's most famous families. The morning started like any other Tuesday at Buckingham Palace, with the changing of the guard and the familiar routines that had governed royal life for centuries. But beneath the ceremonial surface, tension crackled through the ancient walls like electricity before a storm. King Charles had agreed to meet with his younger son for the first time in 8 months, a meeting that palace insiders had been quietly orchestrating for weeks. Prince Harry's return to London hadn't been announced to the press. His flight from Los Angeles had landed at a private airfield outside the city at dawn, and he'd been whisked away in an unmarked vehicle with tinted windows. The secrecy wasn't just about avoiding media attention. It reflected the delicate nature of what everyone hoped would be a healing conversation between a father and son whose relationship had been fractured by years of public disputes, tell-all interviews, and leaked private conversations. Security Chief Inspector Margaret Thornfield had been briefing her team since 6 in the morning. A veteran of 23 years protecting the royal family, she had seen the monarchy weather numerous storms, but nothing quite like the current situation. The protocols for this meeting were unprecedented, not because Harry posed any physical threat, but because the stakes of what might be recorded, shared, or misinterpreted were extraordinarily high. Every precaution, she told her assembled team in the security briefing room beneath the palace. This isn't just about physical safety. We're protecting the integrity of a private conversation that could determine the future relationship between His Majesty and his son. One leaked recording, one misunderstood comment taken out of context, and we're looking at another media firestorm that could damage the crown's reputation for years to come. The team nodded solemnly. They understood that their role today extended far beyond traditional security measures. They were guardians of privacy in an age when privacy had become nearly extinct, especially for members of the royal family. Harry's security detail, a mixture of personal protection officers and palace guards, had been coordinating with the king's security team for days. The logistics were complex, not just because of the physical arrangements, but because of the need to ensure that both parties felt secure and comfortable. Trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild, and every detail of the meeting had to be carefully orchestrated to avoid any sense of ambush or manipulation. As Harry's car passed through the palace gates, he couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. These had once been the most familiar surroundings of his childhood, but now they seemed almost foreign. The guards who saluted his vehicle were faces he didn't recognize. The very building that had once been home now felt like enemy territory, though he desperately hoped that perception would change after today's conversation. The prince had spent the flight from California rehearsing what he wanted to say to his father. He had pages of notes, carefully considered points he wanted to make, and genuine hopes for reconciliation. But he also carried the weight of everything that had been said and written over the past few years. Words that couldn't be taken back, revelations that had shattered the traditional veil of royal privacy, and accusations that had created wounds on both sides of the family divide. Inspector Thornfield met Harry's car personally, a sign of the meeting's importance. She had known Harry since he was a teenager, had been part of his protection detail during his military service, and had watched him grow from a sometimes rebellious young prince into a man trying to forge his own path in the world. But today, their relationship was strictly professional. "Your Royal Highness," she said formally as Harry stepped from the vehicle. "We have some standard security procedures to complete before your meeting with His Majesty." Harry nodded, expecting as much. He had been briefed by his own security team about the likelihood of additional screening. What he hadn't expected was the thoroughness of what followed. The security check took place in a small windowless room that had been converted specifically for sensitive meetings. It wasn't the sort of space where family reunions typically occurred, but nothing about this situation was typical. The room had been swept for electronic surveillance devices multiple times. Its walls were lined with signal-blocking materials, and even the furniture had been specially selected to ensure no recording devices could be concealed within. I need to ask you to remove your phone, any smartwatch, and any other electronic devices, Inspector Thornfield said, producing a specially designed secure container. These will be held in a Faraday cage during your meeting to prevent any possibility of recording or transmission. Harry complied without protest, though he couldn't help but feel the strangeness of the situation. He was being treated like a potential security threat in his own family's home. The irony wasn't lost on him that years of fighting for privacy and freedom from intrusive media coverage had led to this moment where his own family felt the need to protect themselves from him. The security screening continued with a thorough sweep using electronic detection equipment. The officers were professional but methodical, checking every pocket, every seam of his clothing, even the soles of his shoes. They weren't looking for weapons. They were searching for any device capable of recording or transmitting information. "Is this really necessary?" Harry asked quietly, though he continued to cooperate fully. Inspector Thornfield's expression was sympathetic but firm. Given recent events and the sensitive nature of today's discussion, His Majesty's security team insisted on comprehensive precautions. "I hope you understand that this isn't personal, Your Royal Highness. We're simply ensuring that both parties can speak freely without concern about their words being recorded or shared inappropriately." The reference to recent events hung heavy in the air. Both Harry and the security team knew exactly what that meant. The previous year had seen a series of leaked conversations and recorded private moments that had made headlines around the world. Phone calls between Harry and other family members had somehow found their way into tabloid newspapers. Private text messages had been quoted in unauthorized biographies. Even casual conversations at family gatherings had been reported in the press with suspicious accuracy. The palace had launched internal investigations to identify the sources of these leaks, but the damage had been done. Trust within the family had eroded to the point where even basic communication required security protocols that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. As the security check continued, Harry reflected on how they had reached this point. He remembered family dinners where phones were casually left on the table, private conversations in palace gardens without concern about hidden recording devices, and a time when family disputes remained within the family. Those days seemed like ancient history now. The detection equipment beeped as it passed over Harry's jacket pocket. Inspector Thornfield paused, her expression serious. "There's something electronic in your left breast pocket, Your Royal Highness." Harry reached into his pocket and produced a small digital voice recorder, about the size of a USB drive. The room fell silent as everyone stared at the device. Harry's face showed genuine surprise as he looked at the recorder in his palm. "I have no idea how that got there," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and concern. "This isn't mine. I've never seen this device before." Inspector Thornfield carefully took the recorder from Harry's hand using a pair of tweezers, treating it like potential evidence in a criminal investigation. "When did you last wear this jacket, Your Royal Highness?" Harry thought for a moment. "Yesterday evening, at dinner in Los Angeles. But I changed clothes this morning before leaving for the airport. This jacket was packed in my luggage overnight." The security implications were immediately clear to everyone in the room. If Harry was telling the truth, then someone had planted the recording device in his possession, either to create exactly this situation or to secretly record his conversation with the king. If he wasn't telling the truth, then he had attempted to bring recording equipment into what was supposed to be a private, secure meeting with his father. Inspector Thornfield made a quick decision. "I need to inform His Majesty immediately. This changes the entire security profile of today's meeting." "Wait," Harry said, his voice urgent. "Please, let me explain to my father directly. I swear to you, on my honor, that I had no knowledge of this device. Someone is trying to sabotage this meeting, to prevent any possibility of reconciliation between us." The security chief looked at Harry carefully, studying his expression, his body language, his tone of voice. She had been trained to detect deception, and her experience told her that Harry's surprise and concern were genuine. But the implications of the discovery were too serious to ignore, regardless of Harry's intentions or knowledge. "Your Royal Highness, I believe you," she said finally. "But you must understand that this discovery raises questions that go beyond today's meeting. If someone planted this device on you, it suggests a level of surveillance and manipulation that threatens the security of the entire royal family." Harry felt a chill run down his spine as the full implications became clear. Someone had not only invaded his privacy, but had potentially orchestrated a situation designed to destroy any remaining hope of reconciliation with his father. The question was, who had the access, the motivation, and the technical capability to pull off such an operation? "We need to proceed very carefully," Inspector Thornfield continued. "I'll need to brief His Majesty on this discovery, and we'll need to conduct a more thorough investigation into how this device came to be in your possession. In the meantime, the meeting will need to be postponed until we can ensure the complete security of any conversation." Harry's heart sank. He had traveled thousands of miles and endured months of careful diplomatic maneuvering to arrange this meeting with his father. The prospect of reconciliation, which had seemed tantalizingly close just moments ago, was now slipping away because of a device he claimed never to have seen before. "Inspector Thornfield," he said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "Someone is playing a very dangerous game here. They want to prevent this meeting from happening. They want to keep my family divided. We can't let them win." The security chief nodded grimly. She understood the stakes involved, not just for the royal family's personal relationships, but for the monarchy's stability and public perception. A successful reconciliation between the king and his son could help heal wounds that had been festering for years. But the discovery of the recording device had introduced an element of mistrust and suspicion that threatened to make those wounds even deeper. As Inspector Thornfield prepared to brief the king on the situation, Harry remained in the secure room, guarded by officers who now viewed him with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. He stared at the empty container where his personal belongings had been stored, wondering how his attempt at reconciliation had turned into what felt like an interrogation. The palace corridors had never felt so cold, and Harry was beginning to wonder if they ever would again. King Charles stood by the tall windows of his private study, looking out at the palace gardens where he had played as a child and later watched his own sons take their first steps on the manicured lawns. The morning light filtered through the ancient glass, casting long shadows across the room filled with centuries of royal history. He had been preparing for this meeting with Harry for weeks, carefully considering each word he might say, each gesture that could either bridge the chasm between them or widen it further. The knock on his study door came sooner than expected. Inspector Thornfield entered with the measured steps of someone bearing unwelcome news. Charles turned from the window, reading the gravity of the situation in her expression before she spoke a word. "Your Majesty, we have encountered a significant security issue during Prince Harry's screening process," she began, her voice carefully controlled. Charles listened in silence as Inspector Thornfield detailed the discovery of the recording device, watching his face for any reaction. The king's expression remained composed, but his hands, clasped behind his back, tightened imperceptibly. When she finished her report, silence filled the room like a heavy fog. "You believe my son had no knowledge of this device?" Charles asked finally. "Based on his reaction and my professional assessment, yes, Your Majesty." His surprise appeared genuine. However, the implications remained serious regardless of his knowledge or intent. Charles walked slowly to his desk, a magnificent piece that had served monarchs for over 2 centuries. On its polished surface lay the agenda he had prepared for his conversation with Harry, topics they needed to address, bridges he hoped to build. Now those papers seemed almost naive in their optimism. "Inspector, in your professional opinion, what are we dealing with here?" he asked. "Someone with access to Prince Harry's personal belongings, knowledge of today's meeting, and a clear agenda to either record this conversation or sabotage it entirely. The sophistication of the operation suggests professional involvement, possibly intelligence-related." The king absorbed this information with the stoicism that had been bred into him over decades of royal training. But beneath the composed exterior, His mind raced through the possibilities and their implications. If someone was actively working to prevent reconciliation between himself and Harry, it suggested that their family's private pain had become a tool in someone else's larger game. "Has my son been informed that the meeting is postponed?" Charles asked. "Not yet, Your Majesty. I wanted your guidance on how to proceed." Charles considered this carefully. Harry had traveled a great distance, both literally and figuratively, to be here today. To send him away now, under these circumstances, might confirm his worst suspicions about his family's willingness to reconcile. But to proceed without understanding the full security implications would be reckless. Meanwhile, in the secure holding room, Harry sat in uncomfortable silence, accompanied by two security officers who maintained professional courtesy while clearly viewing him as a potential security risk. The minutes stretched endlessly as he wondered what conversations were taking place about his fate and his future relationship with his father. His mind kept returning to the recording device. Who could have placed it in his jacket? The possibilities were limited, but deeply troubling. Someone in his Los Angeles household? A member of his security detail? An intelligence operative with sophisticated surveillance capabilities? Each possibility carried its own disturbing implications about how thoroughly his privacy had been compromised. The device itself had been small and sophisticated, not the sort of equipment available to amateur enthusiasts. Professional-grade surveillance equipment suggested professional-grade surveillance operations. The question was whether he was being monitored by friendly intelligence services, seeking to protect the royal family, hostile foreign agents seeking to gather intelligence, or domestic actors with their own agenda for the monarchy's future. Harry's phone, secured in the Faraday cage, buzzed with incoming messages that he couldn't access. His wife Meghan would be wondering about the outcome of the meeting. His security team in California would be expecting updates. The longer this situation stretched on, the more people would become concerned about his welfare and whereabouts. Inspector Thornfield returned to the holding room with the measured steps of someone who had received clear instructions, but wasn't entirely comfortable with them. "Your Royal Highness, His Majesty has decided to proceed with the meeting, but under modified circumstances," she announced. Harry looked up hopefully, though he could see reservation in her expression. "The conversation will take place in a specially secured room that has been swept multiple times for surveillance devices. Additional security personnel will be stationed nearby, and the conversation will be limited to 1 hour initially. His Majesty's security advisors have insisted on these precautions given the morning's discovery." Harry nodded, understanding that any meeting was better than no meeting, even under these restrictive circumstances. "I appreciate my father's willingness to proceed despite the complications. There is one additional requirement," Inspector Thornfield continued. "Given the sophisticated nature of the device found in your possession, we need to conduct a more thorough security sweep of your person and belongings. This will include a complete change of clothing into garments provided by the palace and a comprehensive electronic sweep of all items you brought with you." The implications were clear. They suspected that the recording device might not have been the only surveillance equipment planted on him. Harry felt a mixture of understanding and humiliation as he realized the extent to which his family now viewed him as a security risk. "Of course," he said quietly. "Whatever is necessary to ensure my father feels secure." The additional security screening took place in a different room, one equipped with more sophisticated detection equipment. Palace staff provided Harry with a simple suit in his size, still elegant, but clearly from standard palace inventory rather than his personal wardrobe. Every item he had brought with him was subjected to detailed examination, from his passport to his wallet to the smallest personal effects. The thoroughness of the search revealed just how seriously the palace security team was taking the threat. They found 2 additional small devices hidden in his luggage, a GPS tracker sewn into the lining of his toiletry bag, and a tiny transmitter disguised as a clothing button. The discovery sent shockwaves through the security team and confirmed their worst fears about the sophistication of the surveillance operation. "Your Royal Highness," Inspector Thornfield said, her voice grave, "you've been under professional surveillance. This isn't the work of journalists or amateur operators. Someone has invested significant resources and expertise in monitoring your movements and activities." Harry stared at the 3 devices laid out on the examination table, feeling violated and vulnerable in ways he had never experienced before. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long have they been watching me?" We'll need to conduct a full technical analysis to determine that, but given the sophistication of these devices, potentially for months. The GPS tracker in particular shows signs of long-term use. The full implications were staggering. Every movement, every conversation, every private moment of Harry's recent life might have been monitored and recorded. His meetings with friends, his conversations with his wife, his interactions with his children, all potentially compromised by an unknown surveillance operation. We need to consider the possibility that this meeting itself has been orchestrated, Inspector Thornfield continued. Someone may have wanted us to find these devices, either to create distrust between you and His Majesty, or to demonstrate their surveillance capabilities as a form of intimidation. Harry felt a chill as he considered this possibility. If the surveillance was intentional rather than covert, it suggested that someone was sending a message, that privacy was impossible, that even the most secure locations could be penetrated, that no conversation was truly private. King Charles received the news of the additional devices with visible concern. The discovery transformed what had been a family security issue into a potential matter of national security. If Harry was under sophisticated surveillance, the implications extended far beyond their personal relationship to questions about royal security, intelligence operations, and the safety of classified information that might have been shared in Harry's presence during his years as a working royal. "Inspector, I need you to coordinate with MI5 immediately," the king instructed. "This is beyond palace security capabilities. We need to understand who is behind this surveillance and what their objectives might be." "Already in progress, Your Majesty. They're sending a technical team to analyze the devices and trace their origin. However, they've advised that sophisticated surveillance equipment often uses untraceable components specifically designed to prevent identification of their source." Charles considered the broader implication. Harry's return to royal duties, even in a limited capacity, had been one of the potential topics for today's discussion. Now those plans seemed impossibly complicated if Harry was under active surveillance by unknown actors. The secure room where the meeting would finally take place was located deep within the palace, surrounded by multiple layers of security and electronic countermeasures. It had been designed for the most sensitive conversations involving national security, not family reunions. The sterile environment seemed to symbolize how far their relationship had deteriorated from the warm family interactions of years past. When Harry was finally escorted to the meeting room, he found his father waiting with the formal bearing that had characterized their recent interactions. Gone was the casual warmth that had once defined their relationship, replaced by the careful courtesy of diplomatic encounters between representatives of different nations. "Father," Harry said simply, unsure of the appropriate protocol for the moment. "Harry," Charles replied, gesturing to a chair across from his own. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss, and I'm afraid our time is now more limited than I had hoped." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had, conducted with the awareness that despite all security precautions, their words might still somehow be monitored or recorded. They spoke carefully, avoiding sensitive topics that might be used against the family if overheard, focusing instead on the immediate crisis of Harry's surveillance situation. "Do you have any idea who might be behind this?" Charles asked. Harry shook his head. "None. That's what makes it so troubling. The surveillance appears professional, long-term, and very well-funded. It's not the work of tabloid journalists or curious photographers. The intelligence services will investigate, but in the meantime, we must consider the implications for your safety and the safety of your family," Charles said. "If someone has been monitoring you this extensively, they likely have detailed information about your daily routines, your security arrangements, and your vulnerabilities." The conversation continued in this vein, touching on practical security matters rather than the emotional reconciliation both had hoped for. The discovery of the surveillance equipment had poisoned the atmosphere of trust that any meaningful personal conversation would require. As their limited time drew to a close, both father and son felt the weight of opportunity lost. They had traveled so far, literally and figuratively, to reach this moment, only to have it compromised by forces beyond their control. "Harry," Charles said as their meeting neared its end, "I want you to know that despite these circumstances, I'm glad you came. The fact that you're here, That you were willing to submit to these security procedures tells me something important about your intentions. Harry felt a flicker of the warmth that had once characterized their relationship. I came because I want us to find our way back to being father and son, not just king and former working royal. I want that too, Charles admitted. But we'll need to resolve this security situation before we can have the honest conversation we both need. As Harry prepared to leave, escorted by the same security detail that had brought him in, both men understood that their relationship had entered uncharted territory. The discovery of professional surveillance had added layers of complexity that neither had anticipated, transforming their personal reconciliation into a matter that now involved intelligence agencies and national security considerations. The palace corridors felt even colder as Harry walked toward the exit, knowing that his next return would depend not on family dynamics, but on the outcome of intelligence investigations and security assessments that were now beyond his control. The intelligence briefing room beneath Thames House, headquarters of MI5, had hosted discussions about threats to the monarchy before, but never quite like this one. 3 floors underground, surrounded by signal-blocking materials and state-of-the-art security measures, Britain's top intelligence analysts gathered around a conference table covered with photographs, technical specifications, and classified reports that would reshape how the royal family understood their own security. Director Sarah Morrison, a veteran of 25 years in intelligence work, studied the 3 surveillance devices that had been found on Prince Harry with the intensity of an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts. Each piece of equipment told a story about sophisticated tradecraft, substantial financial resources, and access to cutting-edge surveillance technology that was typically available only to nation-states or exceptionally well-funded criminal organizations. The GPS tracker shows continuous operation for approximately 14 months, reported Dr. James Chen, MI5's chief technical analyst. The location data it collected was transmitted to a relay station every 6 hours, providing near real-time tracking of Prince Harry's movements throughout his time in California. Morrison absorbed this information grimly. 14 months of surveillance meant that whoever was behind this operation had been planning something significant and had been willing to invest considerable time and resources in intelligence gathering before making their move. The audio recording device is more sophisticated, Dr. Chen continued, voice-activated, with selective recording capabilities that suggest it was programmed to capture specific types of conversations. It wasn't recording everything, it was listening for particular keywords or voice patterns, which suggests, Morrison said, that this wasn't a fishing expedition. Someone was looking for specific information or waiting for particular conversations to take place. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, Inspector Thornfield was conducting her own investigation into how the devices had been planted on Prince Harry. The logistics of the operation were as troubling as the technology involved. Someone had needed intimate access to Harry's personal belongings, detailed knowledge of his travel plans, and the technical expertise to place sophisticated surveillance equipment without detection. The timeline was particularly concerning. Harry's travel plans had been finalized only 3 days before his departure from Los Angeles. The coordination required to plant multiple surveillance devices in that time frame suggested either inside information or an operation that had been prepared well in advance, waiting for an opportunity to be implemented. Palace security footage from Harry's arrival was analyzed frame by frame, but revealed nothing unusual. His luggage had been handled only by trusted security personnel and palace staff who had worked there for years. The devices must have been planted before his arrival in London, which narrowed the investigation to his activities in Los Angeles and his travel arrangements. Back in California, FBI agents working in coordination with British intelligence began the delicate process of investigating Prince Harry's household and security arrangements without alerting the media or creating panic among his family and staff. The scope of the investigation was necessarily limited by diplomatic considerations. Harry was a foreign royal residing in the United States, which created jurisdictional complexities that required careful navigation. The investigation revealed troubling gaps in Harry's personal security that had been exploited by whoever was conducting the surveillance. His California residence, while protected by private security, lacked the comprehensive counter-surveillance measures that would be standard for senior royals in Britain. His daily routines had become predictable. His staff turnover had created opportunities for infiltration, and his desire for a more normal life had led to security practices that prioritized privacy over protection. Dr. Chen's technical analysis of the surveillance devices yielded additional disturbing information. The equipment bore hallmarks of Eastern European manufacturing, but had been modified with components that suggested assembly in multiple countries. The sophisticated nature of this supply chain indicated an operation with international reach and substantial resources. This isn't the work of a single intelligence agency or criminal organization, Dr. Chen explained to Director Morrison. The components suggest a collaborative effort, possibly involving multiple parties with different specializations. Someone coordinated this operation across international boundaries. The implications were staggering. If multiple international actors were involved in surveillance of Prince Harry, it suggested that his personal reconciliation with his father had become entangled in geopolitical considerations that neither he nor the royal family fully understood. Director Morrison authorized expanded surveillance of known intelligence operatives in Britain, focusing particularly on individuals with connections to countries that might have strategic interests in British royal family dynamics. The list of potential suspects included foreign intelligence services seeking leverage over British policy, criminal organizations looking for opportunities to exploit royal family divisions, and even domestic actors with political motivations for keeping the monarchy in crisis. At the same time, Palace security was implementing immediate changes to protect the royal family from similar surveillance operations. New counter-surveillance protocols were being developed, staff security clearances were being reviewed, and electronic sweeping procedures were being enhanced to detect increasingly sophisticated surveillance equipment. The psychological impact on Prince Harry was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire situation. The discovery that his most private moments had been monitored for over a year created a sense of violation that extended far beyond physical security concerns. Every conversation with his wife, every interaction with his children, every supposedly private phone call had potentially been recorded and analyzed by unknown actors for unknown purposes. Harry's security team in California underwent extensive interrogation by FBI agents, but initial investigations suggested that the surveillance had been conducted without their knowledge or involvement. The sophistication of the operation had allowed it to remain hidden from security professionals who were specifically trained to detect such threats. The investigation revealed one particularly disturbing detail. The surveillance equipment had been programmed to activate specifically during phone calls with members of the British royal family. This suggested that the primary objective had been to record Harry's private conversations with his relatives, potentially to gather intelligence about royal family dynamics, succession planning, or sensitive political discussions. Someone was specifically interested in Prince Harry's relationship with his family. Morrison told her analysis team, "This wasn't general surveillance. It was targeted intelligence gathering focused on royal family communications." The revelation that his phone calls with family members had been potentially monitored cast Harry's entire recent history in a new light. Conversations he had believed to be private had possibly been analyzed by foreign intelligence services. Arguments with his brother William, discussions with his father about royal duties, even casual chats with cousins about family events, all potentially compromised. The investigation expanded to examine whether other members of the royal family had been subjected to similar surveillance. Technical sweeps of palace communication systems, royal residences, and personal belongings of senior royals were conducted with unprecedented thoroughness. The results were mixed. While no active surveillance devices were found, evidence suggested that various attempts had been made to compromise royal family communications over the past several years. King Charles received daily briefings on the investigation's progress with growing concern about the implications for constitutional monarchy in an age of sophisticated surveillance technology. If foreign actors could monitor royal family communications at will, it raised fundamental questions about the security of sensitive information related to government consultations, political discussions, and diplomatic communications that were part of his constitutional role. The broader security implications extended beyond the royal family to questions about democratic institutions and national sovereignty. If sophisticated surveillance operations could be conducted against the British royal family with apparent impunity, what other institutions might be similarly vulnerable? The investigation was quietly expanded to examine potential surveillance of government ministers, military leaders, and other high-value targets. Meanwhile, Harry remained in a secure location at an undisclosed palace property while security assessments continued. The isolation was difficult for someone who had spent years fighting for independence and privacy, but the alternative, returning to California with the knowledge that his security had been comprehensively compromised, was unacceptable to both British and American security services. His wife Meghan and their children remained in California under enhanced security protection while investigators worked to determine the full scope of the surveillance operation. The separation was particularly difficult, given that the investigation had revealed that their family's private communications had been monitored, potentially exposing their children to unknown security risks. The technical analysis of the surveillance devices eventually yielded a breakthrough that changed the entire character of the investigation. Chen discovered hidden data storage within the GPS tracker that contained encrypted files with detailed information about Harry's movements, contacts, and activities. When decrypted by British intelligence analysts, the files revealed the true scope of the surveillance operation. The data showed that Harry's surveillance was part of a much larger intelligence-gathering operation, targeting multiple members of the British royal family, senior government officials, and key business leaders. The operation appeared to be designed to map the informal networks of influence and communication that operated parallel to official government channels. "This is espionage on a scale we haven't seen since the Cold War," Morrison told her senior staff. "Someone has been systematically mapping British power structures and influence networks." Prince Harry's surveillance was just one component of a much larger operation. The discovery that Harry's case was part of a broader espionage campaign provided some personal relief. He hadn't been specifically targeted, but had been caught up in a larger intelligence operation. However, it also raised the stakes considerably for British national security and required coordination with allied intelligence services to understand the full scope of the threat. As the investigation expanded internationally, disturbing patterns emerged. Similar surveillance operations had been detected in other NATO countries, targeting political leaders, senior military officers, and influential business figures. The scale suggested a coordinated intelligence campaign by a hostile state actor, though identifying the specific source remained challenging due to the sophisticated techniques used to obscure the operation's origins. The revelation that this was part of a larger espionage campaign fundamentally changed how both the royal family and British intelligence services understood the threats facing constitutional monarchy in the 21st century. Traditional security measures designed to protect against physical threats and conventional espionage were inadequate against sophisticated surveillance technologies and international criminal networks operating with near-state-level resources. For Harry personally, the discovery provided some comfort that he hadn't been personally targeted, but also deepened his sense of violation at learning that his most private family communications had been swept up in a foreign intelligence operation. The knowledge that hostile actors had detailed information about his relationship with his children, his marriage, and his family dynamics created psychological burdens that would require long-term support to address. The investigation was entering a new phase, moving from reactive security measures to proactive intelligence operations designed to identify and neutralize the broader threat to British national security. Prince Harry's case had become a window into vulnerabilities that extended far beyond royal family privacy to questions about democratic institutions and national sovereignty in an age of sophisticated surveillance technology. 6 months after the discovery of surveillance devices on Prince Harry, the secure conference room at GCHQ in Cheltenham hosted an extraordinary meeting of Britain's most senior intelligence officials, senior royals, and government ministers. The investigation that had begun with a routine security check had evolved into one of the most significant counterintelligence operations in British history, revealing vulnerabilities in national security that no one had imagined possible. Director Morrison presented her findings to an audience that included King Charles, Prime Minister Richardson, Defense Secretary Williams, and Foreign Secretary Thompson. The scope of what they had discovered would reshape British intelligence priorities for years to come and force a fundamental reconsideration of royal family security in the digital age. Operation Lighthouse has identified a coordinated intelligence campaign targeting British institutions that has been active for at least 3 years, Morrison began, using the code name assigned to the expanded investigation. Prince Harry's surveillance was one component of a systematic effort to map British power structures, influence networks, and decision-making processes at the highest levels of government and society. The investigation had revealed that the surveillance extended far beyond the royal family. Over 40 senior government officials had been subjected to various forms of electronic monitoring, from cabinet ministers to senior civil servants responsible for defense procurement and intelligence oversight. The operation had been so sophisticated and well concealed that it had remained undetected until the accidental discovery of devices on Harry had triggered comprehensive security reviews across government. King Charles listened to the briefing with the composed expression he had perfected over decades of receiving difficult news, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his posture. The revelation that his family had been unwitting participants in an espionage operation targeting British national security created both personal and constitutional concerns that would require careful navigation. The technical analysis suggests state-level resources and coordination, Dr. Forrestbay's personal security bill, Chen reported. The surveillance equipment, communication protocols, and operational security all indicate an adversary with substantial intelligence capabilities and long-term strategic objectives. Prime Minister Richardson leaned forward in her chair. Do we know who's behind this? Morrison's expression was grim. We have strong indicators pointing to a coordinated effort involving multiple hostile actors, but definitive attribution remains elusive. The operation appears designed specifically to prevent clear identification of its sponsors, which is itself a signature of sophisticated intelligence tradecraft. The investigation had revealed that the surveillance operation had three primary objectives: intelligence gathering about British decision-making processes, mapping of informal influence networks that operated outside official channels, and collection of compromising material that could potentially be used for blackmail or manipulation. The systematic nature of the targeting suggested long-term strategic planning rather than opportunistic intelligence gathering. Prince Harry, who had been living under enhanced security protection while the investigation proceeded, finally received clearance to attend the briefing. His presence in the secure conference room was both symbolic and practical. He was simultaneously a victim of the surveillance operation and a key witness to its methods and impact. Your Royal Highness, Morrison addressed Harry directly. The investigation has confirmed that you were not specifically targeted because of your personal activities or statements. The surveillance was part of a broader mapping exercise designed to understand royal family dynamics and their intersection with government decision-making processes. Harry nodded, though the explanation provided only limited comfort. The knowledge that foreign intelligence services had detailed information about his private conversations with family members continued to weigh heavily on him. Every argument, every reconciliation attempt, every private family discussion had potentially been analyzed by hostile actors for strategic intelligence value. The psychological impact on the entire royal family had been significant. Trust, already strained by years of public disputes and media intrusions, had become even more fragile when family members realized that their most private communications might have been monitored by foreign intelligence services. Family gatherings now included security briefings, and personal phone calls required security protocols that transformed intimate conversations into formal communications. Chen provided additional technical details that illustrated the sophistication of the operation. The surveillance equipment found on Prince Harry represented only the visible component of a much larger technical operation. We've identified multiple communication interception capabilities, data collection from personal devices, and monitoring of digital communications that suggests access to telecommunications infrastructure at the carrier level. The implications were staggering. If hostile actors had compromised British telecommunications infrastructure, the potential for intelligence gathering extended far beyond high-profile targets to include systematic monitoring of government communications, military planning discussions, and sensitive diplomatic negotiations. Defense Secretary Williams raised the question that was foremost in everyone's mind. What's our response? We can't allow this level of penetration to continue. Morrison outlined a comprehensive counterintelligence strategy that had been developed over months of analysis and planning. Operation Lighthouse has moved from investigation to active measures. We're implementing systematic counter-surveillance protocols across government, conducting technical sweeps of all sensitive facilities and working with allied intelligence services to map the full extent of this operation. Traditional boundaries between domestic security, foreign intelligence, and military capabilities were being dissolved in favor of integrated approaches that could address sophisticated, multifaceted threats. For Prince Harry personally, the investigation's conclusions provided a pathway back to fuller participation in royal family activities, but under security conditions that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. His communications were now conducted through encrypted channels. His movements required advanced security planning, and his residence in California had been transformed into what was essentially a secure facility with comprehensive counter-surveillance measures. The broader implications for constitutional monarchy were equally significant. King Charles faced the reality that his role as head of state made him and his family permanent targets for foreign intelligence operations seeking to understand and potentially influence British decision-making processes. The traditional balance between royal family privacy and public accountability had become complicated by national security considerations that required new approaches to both royal protection and constitutional governance. The investigation had also revealed the extent to which modern surveillance technology had outpaced traditional security measures. Equipment that would have been science fiction just a decade earlier was now readily available to well-funded intelligence operations, creating new vulnerabilities that required completely new approaches to personal and institutional security. Prime Minister Richardson authorized additional resources for a comprehensive security upgrade across government that would cost hundreds of millions of pounds, but was deemed essential for protecting democratic institutions against sophisticated surveillance threats. The program would include new secure communication systems, enhanced counter-surveillance capabilities, and expanded training for government officials about digital security threats. The human cost of the operation extended beyond immediate security concerns to long-term psychological impacts on everyone involved. Harry's children would grow up with security protocols that most people couldn't imagine. His marriage had been strained by the knowledge that their most intimate communications had been monitored, and his relationship with his extended family remained complicated by questions about trust and security that had no easy answers. King Charles made a decision that surprised many in the intelligence briefing. "I want to meet with my son privately, without any security monitoring or recording," he announced. "Whatever the risks, we need to have at least one honest conversation that isn't filtered through security protocols." Inspector Thornfield looked uncomfortable. "Your Majesty, given what we've learned about surveillance capabilities, we can't guarantee the security of any unmonitored conversation." "Then we'll accept that risk," Charles replied. "Some things are more important than perfect security." The private meeting between father and son took place in a garden at Windsor Castle, surrounded by comprehensive security, but without any electronic monitoring or recording. For the first time in over a year, they were able to speak freely about their relationship, their family, and their hopes for the future, without concern about who might be listening. "Harry," King Charles said as they walked among the roses his mother had planted decades earlier, "I want you to know that learning about the surveillance has helped me understand some of the pressures you've been under. Knowing that your private conversations were being monitored explains some of the tension and mistrust that has characterized our recent communications." Harry felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Father, there were times when I wondered if I was going mad, when private conversations seemed to be public knowledge almost immediately. Now I understand that it wasn't paranoia. We really were being watched." Their conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics they hadn't been able to discuss honestly in years. The surveillance operation, as violating and troubling as it had inadvertently provided a framework for understanding some of the misunderstandings and mistrust that had characterized their recent relationship. The investigation's final phase focused on preventing similar operations in the future. Working with allied intelligence services, British counterintelligence officials were developing new protocols for detecting and neutralizing sophisticated surveillance operations before they could gather significant intelligence. The program would serve as a model for protecting democratic institutions against 21st-century espionage threats. Prince Harry's experience had become a case study in modern surveillance threats and countermeasures, though the details would remain classified for decades to protect operational capabilities and sources. His willingness to cooperate fully with the investigation, despite the personal costs, had provided intelligence services with unprecedented insight into sophisticated surveillance operations. The long-term implications of Operation Lighthouse would influence British intelligence priorities and royal family security arrangements for years to come. The discovery that constitutional monarchy in the digital age required new approaches to balancing transparency, privacy, and security would reshape how democratic institutions protected themselves against sophisticated threats while maintaining their essential character and public accountability. As Harry prepared to return to California with his family, now under enhanced security arrangements that would allow him to resume a more normal life while protecting against future surveillance, he reflected on how the crisis had ultimately strengthened his relationship with his father and provided new understanding of the pressures facing constitutional monarchy in an interconnected but dangerous world. The palace corridors that had felt so cold during his security screening now seemed warmer, not because the surveillance threat had been eliminated, but because the crisis had forced his family to confront their challenges honestly and work together toward solutions that protected both their personal relationships and their constitutional responsibilities. The story that had begun with a routine security check had evolved into something far more significant, a glimpse into the future of democratic governance in an age of sophisticated surveillance technology, and a reminder that even the most private family relationships could become entangled in geopolitical struggles that required both personal courage and institutional wisdom to navigate successfully.